or it on this computer. There we go. So it is Monday, February 13th, and we are starting a new social studies unit. So the first thing I want you to do is kind of find your social studies book. And we've gone back to mod 2 of the first book. So you guys have 2 social studies books, Hunter and David, and you want to go to the first one. So this is just mod 2 in the first one. We're not going to do a lot of these exercises in here. Of course, you can do them if you want to, but you don't have to do them all. Yeah, good. That's it. So we're taking a look at a time when the world was not as connected as it is today. So we're talking about a long, long time ago. Groups of people started with very small groups, villages, small groups of people. And then over time, as people were able to come up with ways to grow food and to move from place to place, larger cities grew. And then everybody started fighting for things. As things got more crowded and there were fewer resources, we had lots of wars, a lot of fighting in Europe, but people started in Africa and then spread up into Europe because Europe is very close to Africa and the climate was good for growing things. And so people moved up to where there was water for growing things, and the societies got bigger and bigger and more crowded. And they cut down, honestly, almost all the trees in Europe to make those big ships that they were sailing around the world in. And so they didn't have many trees left, and they fought over things, and they wanted gold, and people are greedy, the truth is, and people wanted land, and so they started exploring the world to see what was out there, what they could grab, what they could take, what places they could live. And this started ages and ages ago with the Vikings traveling around and conquering other people, and the Polynesians getting into these big rafts and crossing the ocean and colonizing different islands. And for our country in the Northwest and North America, people came over. They actually walked across a land bridge that used to exist between Russia and Alaska. It was called the Bering Land Bridge. And then over time, as the oceans rose, it has flooded that. So now, even though in places in Alaska, you can look across the water and see Russia, you can't walk between it anymore. But at one time people could, and they walked down here, and that's how our Native Americans got started in the United States. So those people all originated from Africa and spread out across the rest of the world. The problem was in Europe, at a certain point, life was not pleasant. There were a lot of people. It was expensive. There was no land. The air was polluted. The trees were chopped down, and life was tough. And so the European rulers needed stuff. They wanted gold and silver and trees and beaver pelts, they wanted all that stuff. And so they started funding these big explorations across the ocean. Now, like I mentioned earlier today, when this happened, the only people who we remember today, well, that's not quite, but the first people that we remember, like I was taught as a little kid, that Columbus discovered America. Well, that wasn't quite true, was it? There were people living in America long before Columbus. And frankly, Leif Erikson, a Viking explorer, was probably here first. And Columbus never stepped foot in America. He went to an island off the mainland. And so, we get all sorts of information from history, but who gets history? It's just other people, right? So it's kind of their opinion versus your opinion. So
I have a question.
Yeah.
Are we gonna be doing this quiz together?
Well, we're not doing the quiz till tomorrow, but we can do it together if you'd like. Would you like to?
Yes, because I really need to.
We'll do it tomorrow. But so I guess what I'm trying to say to you is, as we're reading history, if you see something and you're like, I don't know if I believe that, I think you should feel really good about reading with a critical eye like that, history. Because history is just one person's opinion. In fact, a lot of women think the fact that it's called history, H-I-S-tory, is because a lot of it was written by men, right? So you don't read that much about famous women explorers. You don't read very much about famous Polynesian explorers or Chinese explorers. Does that mean they didn't exist? No, they existed. People just didn't write a lot about them, right? So today we're going to watch a little video talking to us about what was going on in the world and what was happening with exploration. And then we're going to start this unit, but I'd like you to read it, asking yourself, whose story is this and whose voice is missing from this? And then we are going to do the quiz, but we're not going to do all of the assignments. So my first little thing I want to tell you is this. How would you feel if, let's say your parents had a lot of children in the house and the house was getting crowded and the rooms were getting really full of a lot of people, but you had this nice big room. Let's say you're the firstborn and you had a nice big room. You'd lived there your whole life, had nice stuff in it. And one day when you weren't home, or maybe when you were asleep, your siblings came in and moved into your room and took everything. And when you woke up and said, dudes, can't we just share it? They were like, no, and locked you in the closet or made you clean the room every day. That's kind of what these explorers did around the world. They kind of went places and took things without asking. In the case of Mexico, the man who took over Mexico, the European explorer, he tricked them into thinking he was a god, and they basically gave him everything. He just kind of tricked them, which is horrible. And he killed the ruler, locked him up and killed him. So these stories we're going to hear about history are not the nicest stories, and they're not very ethical stories, but they are true. So some of them. So let me show you this little video and see if it puts it into context. And then today we're working on 2.01, exploration across the Atlantic. Here we go. Oops, where did my video go? It's not there. Where is it? Here it is. There it is. Okay.
Going to learn about the European Age of Exploration, the explorers who connected Europe to North and South America, and the culture of the indigenous people who occupied the existing land. Let's go! Historians refer to the Age of Exploration as a period of time ranging from the early 1400s through the 1600s CE, when European nations began exploring the world. During this time, European explorers found new routes to India, much of the Far East, and the Americas. When we're learning about history, it's important that we practice switching our perspective, or point of view, to the various groups of people whom we're learning about. Let's start with an example. Imagine you are at your favorite park, and you notice that there's something lying in the grass. You walk over, reach down, and discover the coolest gadget you've ever seen. It feels like your lucky day. You are so excited to have found this treasure. You don't see anyone around, so you decide to bring it home, and it becomes your new favorite toy. Across the park, there's another child. They were playing in the grass when the gadget fell from their pocket. They have looked all over the park for this special toy, but can't find it anywhere. Your lucky day feels like their worst day. Your gain of this new gadget comes as a result of their loss. Both people in the same park will have a different point of view about the event that transpired. You may be wondering, what in the world does this have to do with the European Age of Exploration in the Americas? Throughout this lesson, we will be switching perspectives to gain a better understanding of the various groups of people involved in this age of exploration. Studying various points of view in history gives us a better understanding of what actually happened. Now, let's begin with the perspective of Portugal during the European Age of Exploration. During the early 1400s, Prince Henry, who is often also referred to as Henry the Navigator, funded and encouraged exploration and the study of navigation. The definition of navigation is the act or practice of steering, directing the course of, or finding a way through. Portuguese explorers began venturing southward along the Atlantic coast of Africa. At the time, Africa was rich in a variety of foods, gold, and spices, including salt. Yes, salt. Salt has been an extremely valuable commodity throughout history. A commodity is a raw material or primary agricultural product that can be bought and sold. Salt not only flavors food, but also acts as a preservative, meaning it prevents the food from decaying. The refrigerator wasn't invented until the 1800s, so most human civilizations throughout history have had to rely on natural preservation processes, like the use of salt, especially when preserving meat. The Portuguese first returned from their journey to Africa in 1420 with a variety of spices and gold. The Portuguese explorers also returned with enslaved people, who they kidnapped from villages of Africa to sell in the European slave market. Much of the wealth that was generated by these journeys was done so by claiming human beings as a form of property. The Portuguese next set their sights on India. When Portuguese explorers, including the famous navigator Vasco da Gama, reached India in 1498, they found a highly developed Indian Ocean commerce offering commodities unavailable in Europe, such as colorful washable cotton linens, finely crafted porcelain, and tea. Wealthy Europeans coveted these new commodities, and the demand for valuable items from India grew. At the time, it was nearly impossible to travel from Europe to Asia over land. To access India, Portuguese explorers traveled by ships all the way down the coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, and up into India. The voyage took a very long time. A better route was needed. At this time, there was a young Italian-born explorer named Christopher Columbus. He had a different idea for a route to India. Instead of going around the continent of Africa, he proposed Europeans could take the Northwest Passage to arrive on the Asian continent. As a student of geography, he presented this idea of a new route to the wealthy King of Portugal. When the Portuguese king denied to fund his journey, he turned to Spain. Spain's rulers at the time, Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon, were devout Catholics and well into their pursuit of making Catholicism the only religion in Spain. This lofty and often violent pursuit was expensive for the Spanish royalty. So, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella agreed to sponsor Columbus's trip, with the agreement that he would bring back gold and spices in return. In 1492, Columbus and his crew boarded 3 ships, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria. Their intended route was west from Spain and then north through the Northwest Passage before heading down and passing Russia and landing among the East Indies. The East Indies are comprised of several countries including the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. While this route was logical, Columbus was off on his calculation of the circumference of the Earth. In other words, he thought the size of the Earth was much smaller than it actually was. 2 months into their journey, Columbus and his crew made landfall, but not in the East Indies as they had intended. So where did they wind up instead? They actually landed in the Caribbean islands, specifically on an island in the present-day Bahamas. Columbus didn't know that the continents of North and South America existed, and therefore initially mistook the land as being part of the East Indies, therefore incorrectly calling the people he met living on the land Indians. The people occupying the land were those of the Taino tribe. Historians believe the Taino people settled in Central America around 400 BCE and had developed their own complex political, religious, and social systems. They were skilled navigators themselves and had a thriving agricultural system. In their native language, they created music and wrote poetry. Speaking of the language of the Taino people, if you've ever snoozed in a hammock, enjoyed barbecue food, paddled a canoe, baked a potato, or tracked a hurricane, you have spoken words of the Taino language. These words, along with many others, were all invented long before Christopher Columbus arrived in 1492. From the perspective of the European explorers, this land was new. It later became referred to as the New World. It was during this time that the explorers adopted the concept of colonization to the New World, the action of settling among and establishing control over the indigenous people of an area to benefit and enrich the colonizers. Columbus and his crew did not find an abundance of gold and silver as they had hoped, but believed that with enough searching, they may still find the riches they set out to discover and bring back to Europe. Columbus spent months traveling back and forth among the Caribbean islands in search of precious stones and gold and silver he had promised the King and Queen of Spain. Unable to find any riches, Columbus left his brothers to manage a colony they named Hispaniola and headed back to Spain. But now, back to the perspective of the Taino people. After nearly 1,800 years of living among their own people on this land, foreign European travelers appeared one day by ships to their land. The strange visitors carried weapons unknown to the Taino people, including both guns and swords. The Taino tribe was later forced to work on plantations and search for gold. They were also exposed to diseases from Europe that had not yet existed in the Americas. Between the harsh enslavement of the Taino people by the Spanish colonizers and the introduction of diseases such as smallpox, most people of the Taino tribe were killed by the mid-1500s. In total, Columbus made 4 trips from Spain back to the Caribbean islands. On his second trip, Columbus continued to look for gold, but this time he had a larger crew because he had enslaved the indigenous Taino people of the Caribbean islands. Unable to find any precious stones or gold, Columbus sent the Spanish king and queen 500 enslaved people from the islands. This is the first known shipment of enslaved people across the Atlantic Ocean, and it's not clear how many survived the difficult journey. We now know that the areas we call North and South America have been inhabited by Native Americans long before Columbus was even born. And Columbus never actually made it to what is now the continental United States. Instead, he traveled to the Caribbean in 1492 and 1493, and made his way to Central America in 1502 and 1504, before he died in 1506. He was never aware of how close he truly was to the huge land masses of North and South America. So, if Christopher Columbus and his crew weren't the first to discover the Americas, why is the explorer so famous? Many believe that his journeys were important because he was the first European of his day to sail the New World. Although, of course, we now know that Viking explorers had landed in North America 500 years earlier. From Columbus's perspective, along with the rest of Europe at the time, happening upon the Americas paved the way for further exploration of the region. At the time, more land meant more wealth and power, so many kings and queens of Europe rushed to claim land and began to colonize. This conquering and colonizing of the Americas would change the world, unfortunately at the detriment of many indigenous people. It's time to practice what you learned about the New World and the European age of exploration in the Americas. And remember, stay curious and keep exploring. You never know what you might discover.
So, oops, I forgot to close that. I always do that. Here we go. So I just thought it was kind of interesting thinking about the different groups that have explored. And even though the chapter is going to break it into like the English explorers, the Spanish explorers, and that's about it. I thought it would be good to take a quick look at some of the other explorers out here. If you Google ancient Polynesian explorers, you come up with tons and tons of information about how the Polynesians, many years before anybody else, were sailing their boats a long way across the oceans, all amongst this part of the world in the Pacific. So kind of interesting, the Polynesians. And then over here we have women who were explorers and never really got credit for it. Jeanne Barré, a French woman in the 1700s. She went on huge explorations. And she went all the way around the world. Here's Sacagawea, who, if you have studied Lewis and Clark at all, She went along with them, and she was amazing. She was only 16 years old, and she had a baby that she had and carried through the whole trip. And without her, they probably would not have made it or survived. We had the American suffragettes who fought for our right to vote. Isabella Bird, she was a British writer, traveler, photographer, and naturalist. She inherited a bunch of money and traveled through India and traveled around. Nellie Bly was a pioneer in the field of going around the world. She was inspired by this book, Around the World in 80 Days, and she documented her trips. Here's a British woman who traveled by bicycle. Here's Bessie Coleman. She wanted to fly airplanes, and so she was one of the first women flying airplanes. She'd been rejected a lot, but finally got into flight school. Very cool. And Amelia Earhart, you might have heard a little bit about her. She was a little bit later, and she's probably a little more famous than some of the other women. And then here's all sorts of famous little known explorers from different countries, amazing forgotten explorers. We've got this man. He was, he discovered Timbuktu in Mali from Europe. Didn't discover it, but found it. A Swiss scientist. This was a Chinese explorer who did great things or went a long way through Afghanistan. Pythias, 4th century, a Greek sailor. More of the Picard. Here is a Moroccan explorer, Ibn Battuta, which is kind of interesting. He traveled clear across Persia and then back to Baghdad. Hanno the navigator, Carthaginian. I don't even know what that is. Carthaginian. And Harkuf, I thought Amadi would enjoy this. He was, or not just Amadi, but Nora. He was an Egyptian explorer. Very cool. Have you heard of him before? And here's a Spanish explorer. There's just tons of people who we don't know as much about. So as you go through this chapter, be thinking about the other people who explored whose stories we haven't heard. Eli, go ahead. Question.